Hi, I'm Andrew Rogers, and this is Indian Hill Manor. Indian Hill Manor was built in 1916 for Charles Barrett and his wife Esta. Barrett was a part of several of Chicago's elite social clubs and the president of DeVoe and Reynolds Paint Company. Esta was a talented singer-songwriter that previously toured Europe. Once they got married, they decided to look for an area outside of Chicago to build a manor. Rural manors were becoming more popular, and they were typically owned by wealthy Chicagoans who sought to escape from the hot and dirty city. The idea of an expensive manor is commonly used by wealthy businessmen in the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was a time from 1865 to 1898 with an intense industrialization. It all came from the Industrial Revolution, which focused on mass production. There were also new technologies that made communication and transportation easier, such as trains. Many people at this time were becoming extremely wealthy, but at the same time, there were incredible amounts of poverty. The owners and higher-ups of some companies are becoming extremely wealthy on the backs of workers, which included a lot of immigrants. In addition to that, business owners were also using political corruption and bribes to make their companies more successful. Many people would assume that the Industrial Revolution would help the wealth of all Americans, but this was not the case. If it was the case, this area may have been called the Golden Age, but the term Gilded Age, coined by Mark Twain, will forever be in the history books. The word gilded refers to a thin layer of gold. With this being said, Mark Twain was being sarcastic in saying that America has a thin layer of gold, meaning the few rich, covering up a thick layer of tin, meaning the poor. Jacob Riis was a photographer at this time, and in the 1890s, he went around Lower Manhattan and took photos in a collection which he called How the Other Half Lives. These included photos of immigrants and poor living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which at that time was the most dense location on Earth. This collection gives us a good insight on the lives of the poor. At this time, many business owners and presidents were living in luxurious mansions. How is it that so many get so rich, but still so many are so poor? Now let me be clear, I'm not saying that Charles Barrett was a part of this corruption. There were many businessmen at the time who were very honest and humble gentlemen. During the Gilded Age, Barrett was a successful businessman and a part of many of Chicago's most social elite clubs. With all of this going, he must have brushed shoulders with some of these businessmen. As I stated before, he was the president of DeVoe and Reynolds Paint Company, which eventually sold for $60 million, which is around $450 million in today's economy. With this being said, he had the finances to build himself and his new wife this beautiful manor. But why colonial revival? Before we can dig into this, we have to understand what colonial revival was and why it was. At its start, colonial revival was a social movement that looked to romanticize past for inspiration to modern problems. It was hijacked by architects in the 1880s, and the focal point became homes. However, it all started in the 1870s. Americans were troubled by Civil War carnage, Reconstruction depression, and rampant corruption in Washington. By the 1880s, boatloads of immigrants docked at ports. Religious issues and new industrialization raised problems and caused riots. These unsettling times encouraged people to turn to the past, back to a golden age of American values. They looked back at a time that was then romanticized of honest working pioneers and selfless farmers. By preserving and reproducing the colonial style, it was thought that the American values would be to a higher degree. By 1890, colonial revival dominated the Northeast and was spreading towards the Southwest. In 1893, Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition. The exposition was an influential social and cultural event that had profound effects on architecture. The designs put together as a finished exposition was called the White City. During the day, the buildings were simply white, but at night, electric lights would make the buildings glow in magnificent colors. People traveled from around the world to see this architecture. It sparked interest in America's colonial past. It was a major drive behind the colonial revival's popularity. After the Columbian Exposition, colonial revival was unmistakably the national style. There was an understanding that the architecture and home furnishings could shape character. This idea was called associationism. Parents who wanted to raise their children with noble colonial values such as honesty, sincerity, strength, and courage better raise them in a colonial-style house with colonial furniture. It's very interesting that many wealthy people of this time are making their money on new products and new technologies, but at the same time they're using that money in building homes with traditional architecture. Some recognizable individuals doing the same thing around the same time is Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Carnegie. All three of these men were building incredible businesses on modern technologies such as railroad, oil, and steel, but they're using this money to build traditional houses. Rockefeller has the most similar story to Charles Barrett. Rockefeller was an oil tycoon. He built a company that made him more money than he knew what to do with his worth being close to $660 billion in today's economy. In 1913, John D. Rockefeller built a mansion for he and his family. The mansion was designed colonial revival and shares many architectural similarities with Indian Hill Manor. Rockefeller's mansion was called Kykut. This was derived from the Dutch word meaning lookout. It was named Kykut because of its location. The mansion was situated on the highest point in Pocono Hills, overlooking the Hudson River. Similarly, Indian Hill sits on the highest point of all of Winnebago County, looking over the Kishwaukee and Rock River. One difference is that Barrett was looking to get out of the city. This was partially because he wanted a farm in addition to his manor. When Barrett moved to Rockford, it was not nearly as populated as it is today, especially in the South. In 1916, when the manor was built, Rockford's population was approximately 45,000 in total. Rockford now has a population of over 150,000. The south side of Rockford is still rural today, but as you can see from the pictures, there's a lot more surrounding it. Let's head outside to see some more of the exterior architectural characteristics. One of the first things we notice is the abundance of brick. In colonial revival architecture at this time, shingles and clapboard is mostly used, but brick was preferred. The problem is that it was still too expensive for people until after 1920, when brick veneer construction made brick more affordable. Although, because of his financial backing, Charles Barrett was able to afford the wire-cut brick, as you can see here. As we are approaching, notice the two-story construction. 2 or 3 stories is what is usually seen, but single-story construction is almost never seen. Hip roofs are the most common in colonial revival manors. In more simple homes in the colonial revival styles, gable roofs are more common. Also notice the windows. In the colonial revival style, multi-pane double-hung windows are primarily used. As you can see here, the windows are usually placed in groups. On this side of the manor, we see groupings of 2 or 3 windows. Window construction is also to be noticed. The design of these revival-style windows are similar, but never reproductions of originals. This is due to the modern ways of glass making. Now glass manufacturers have found ways to create larger panes of glass that were more readily available and cheaper than ever before. With this being said, windows were designed to look similar to originals, but they incorporated the new ways of glass production. Most colonial revival homes are designed with rectangular plans. These plans have porches or sunrooms on 1 or more sides. The manor is a little different. As you can see here, there is an L-shaped floor plan. The servants' wing of the house is for the most part what comes off the main rectangular plan. With this being said, it still uses the rectangular massing of the main block. Also notice the proportions of the living room, dining room, and master bedroom. They all have specific ties back to colonial architecture. The main entry door is also an important characteristic that distinguishes colonial revival architecture. In later colonial revival, we see the front door at the center, but as you can see here, in this manner, the door is shifted slightly to the right, which was more common in the earlier days. The front door is always ornamented with flanking columns like these, or sometimes column-like pilasters. A light is also often hung just above the door. The ellipse canopy over the front door is very Adam in style, but was common to this period of colonial design. Upon entry of most colonial revival homes, we can assume that we'll be walking into a room with a grand staircase. Let's go in and see if this manor follows this pattern. Look at this. Just as we expect, a grand staircase as soon as we enter the manor. Also notice the 18th century balusters that are also very common in the colonial revival era. There are many specific furniture selections in the colonial revival era, such as Chippendale, Hepplewhite, Federal, and William and Mary. We'll see many of those today. Actually, this desk right here is William & Mary. This manor holds many modern technologies of its time, such as intercom, central vacuum, central hot water heating, and commercial-grade clothes dryers. When this manor was constructed, it was built with gas lighting fixtures, but they were expecting an electrical conversion. This is due to electricity now becoming available beyond the central city. Polished hardwood floors are often seen. As we make our way into the living room, notice all of the polished hardwood floors. The hardwood floors in this manor are made of 2x8s turned on their sides. This provides fire protection. This is increased by the 12 to 16 inches of poured concrete below the wood. The Great Chicago Fire happened less than 50 years prior, and country gentlemen could afford this extremely fireproof construction. As we make our way into the living room, you can notice some more important characteristics, such as the light-colored walls. The light blue in the background makes the ornamented wallpaper pop forward. Take a look down at the floor. This pattern is called chintz. Chintz was a common pattern which used flower patterns with light-colored backgrounds. Also, notice the pictures hung on the walls. They are hung on exposed ropes from the picture rail. At this time, we start to see some frames being hung directly to the walls without ropes, but it's not common. Also notice that pictures are hung symmetrically. More familiar furniture can be seen in the corner. Chippendale chairs are recognizable by the backrest patterns and the forms of the legs. If you look at the furniture overall in this room, you will notice that they are arranged for conversation. This came from Victorian customs. In a colonial home, furniture is always pushed against the wall. Now, let's make our way into the dining room. The dining room uses a similar blue color with also a lot more white. I hope as we've been walking through the inside that you've noticed a lot more white woodwork. This craze can be traced back to the White City at the Chicago Fair, as I talked about earlier. It was understood that having an abundance of white was an important characteristic. It helped to hide the rough wood look, and it was also much more sanitary. Ceilings are usually left unornamented, but sometimes we'll see some ornamentation. Take a look back down at the floor. These floor mats are called American Oriental mats, and they share the house with the chintz mats that I mentioned before. All of these things are what set colonial revival architecture apart from all other architectural styles. It's interesting to think that this manor itself was being built at the same time as Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt were also building these large mansions. I wish I had more time to show you more, but today that's all the time we have. I'm Andrew Rogers, and this has been Indian Hill Manor. Bye!